Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 10 musical masterpieces. And I mean masterpieces. I mean really great music composed since 1960. Now, some of you have said to me on numerous occasions, well, you don't talk too much about music written after 1950, and your idea of contemporary music is the first half of the 20th century, etc., etc., etc. Well, let me just say, in my own defense, first of all, mostly I'm talking about recordings. And what gets recorded is what I talk about. What doesn't get recorded, I don't talk about so much. Or if there's just one recording of something, we're talking about things that have a certain cachet attached to them because they've been performed enough to get a certain level of attention. And things that are extremely recent tend not to get quite that level of attention. But if we remove that criterion, then we can talk about a lot of music written in the latter half of the 20th century and even more recently than that. So there's that element which I think I want to bring to your notice. The other thing is this. There are a lot of, why don't we go through the list and I can explain it easier than try and doing it in this sort of preliminary way. What motivated this talk is the fact that we've been going through Howard Taubman's 1953 Building a Record Library, looking at quite a few works that are included that were very, very recent in 1953. And really have become repertory standards since then. So it's really a fascinating thing to go through and see, what has been written recently and what is being recorded and what people are noticing. And I think that the results are going to be salutary, to say the least. So let's start, shall we? Number 1, Ginastera, Piano Concerto Number 1. Oh, what a great piece. This concerto, which is completely atonal, which is what makes it so marvelous, by the way, because it's atonal, marvelous atonal, has a finale called Toccata con Fuoco, which is insanely virtuosic and exciting, and which became a track on an Emerson, Lake and Palmer disc with Ginastera's approval, which gave the work an enormous amount of attention in the 70s, basically. And since then, it's kind of fallen back a little bit. You don't see it recorded as often as it should be because it's absolutely thrilling. But it has been recorded 3 or 4 times, and it's a masterpiece. And there you go. I mean, is it ever going to be as popular as Prokofiev's Third Piano Concerto? No, it isn't. It isn't because it's much more difficult to listen to. It's that simple. But is it a great work? For sure. And it's out there. So there you go. Number 2, Malcolm Arnold Symphony No. 5. Possibly the greatest of the 9 Malcolm Arnold symphonies, all of which are worth listening to. I mean, he was a wonderful composer and a splendid symphonist, and his music doesn't get nearly the attention it deserves, largely because it has a sense of humor and because it's so imbued with the spirit of popular music idioms. So people basically piss on it, which I think is just obnoxious because greatness is greatness. It doesn't matter what's in it. What's in it is absolutely splendid. The 5th Symphony actually has been recorded, let me see, 1, 2, 3, at least 3 or 4 times. And it's so, it has, you could argue, it's out there, it's getting attention. One of the differences that I think we need to point out, though, which was the other point I was going to mention, but here's where to do it, is that pieces which get recorded back in the 50s, the 40s, the 50s, they had to have a certain, let's just say political correctness or advocacy, because there were only a few major labels. There were always smaller labels, there were always little independent labels, but essentially there were 3 or 4 major labels who had all the major artists. So if a contemporary work were to get attention, like a Shostakovich symphony, for example, it would have to have the attention of one of the major artists exclusively signed to a major label. And that immediately raised the bar very, very high. Nowadays, it doesn't mean anything. Everything's getting recorded. It costs nothing to do it. You set up your little digi-player and, someone else pays for the orchestra and the conductor, and voila, every piece of music ever written gets recorded. And so we have, the process by which something becomes classical, which was, it was performed live before audiences, and then major artists heard about it, and one of them might play it and record it. That's gone. Nowadays, everybody does everything, and the whole process by which something becomes classical has become an electronic one. It's not so much based on physically audiences going to hear live music. It's based on people having access to electronic recordings of that music. And so there's a much wider variety of stuff out there, and it's a much more random sort of process than it used to be. Whereas recordings used to represent the cream rising to the top. Now they represent all the glop that's underneath the cream. And how the cream's going to rise to the top, who knows? Who knows? So there we are. Malcolm Arnold's Fifth Symphony, right? I digress. Number 3. Those were both, by the way, the Ginastera and the Walton from 1961. Now we go to Walton's Variations on a Theme by Hindemith, 1963. One of the great sets of orchestral variations, an absolutely glorious masterpiece that none other than George Szell and the Cleveland Orchestra made the premiere recording of, or one of the premiere recordings of it, because I think Hindemith did it himself or somebody else. But it was, I think Szell's was the first, and it doesn't matter because it was the best, and Walton was like drooling over it, and it's fabulous, and it's since been recorded, half a dozen times. It's really a masterwork. It's probably Walton's greatest late work. The tune itself is splendid. It's the middle movement of Hindemith's cello concerto, and the variations are ingenious. One group speeds up, the next group's odd numbers speed up, even numbers slow down, or the other way around. But that's what happens. It's really just brilliant. Then there's a dazzling fugue at the end, and it's marvelous, absolutely marvelous. So there you go, another masterpiece. You'll say, well, it's tonal, it's not avant-garde. You know what? I don't care about that nonsense because fads are irrelevant, completely irrelevant to our decision of what deserves attention and what does not. The only thing that matters is whether it's good music. And there's tons of avant-garde music that's very good music. I could talk about Morton Feldman, who I've done videos of, and lots of other people like that. But we don't have to deal with it. Shostakovich, Symphony No. 15, 1971. People tend to forget that Shostakovich was not exclusively a first half of the 20th century guy. He made it well into the second half of the 20th century and wrote a hell of a lot of great music after that cutoff point. And his 15th Symphony is a repertory standard. It's got dozens of recordings at this point, or a dozen recordings. It's been reduced for chamber ensemble. It gets all kinds of attention, and it's brilliant. So there you go. Next, Rzewski. Friedrich Rzewski, The People United Will Never Be Defeated, one of the great theme and variation works for piano. It's a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece on the par with the Goldberg variations, the Beethoven Diabelli variations, Reich's L'Art du Varier, if you want to go there. It's just an incredible piece. And this has also had, it must be about a dozen recordings now, by many, many major pianists. Marc-André Amelin, Ursula Oppens, who was the dedicatee and who recorded it twice. You really know you've arrived when you're getting multiple recordings by the same artist of the same work, and it's a contemporary work. But that's a piece that any sane person who likes piano variations type pieces, hour-long piano works in that type, should own and will adore. It's just fabulous. So after Zevski, that was number 5. We have number 6, John Adams, Harmonielehre. Now this is, another one of those tendencies to take, modern pieces and give them stupid titles to, puzzle people. Harmonielehre is basically a 3-movement symphony. That's what it is. For various postmodern reasons, Adams doesn't want to call it that, but that's okay. The Harmonielehre was Schoenberg's harmony treatise. None of that has anything to do with the music, and it has further titles for each movement: the Amphitas-Wound and Meister Eckhart and Quacky, and that kind of nonsense drives me crazy. You just listen to the music, and it's absolutely splendid music. I saw a marvelous performance with the Cleveland Orchestra under Franz Welser-Most in Cleveland. I don't know, maybe it was 20 years ago, 15 years ago, but the piece has been recorded a few times. It deserves it. Adams is a masterful composer. He's one of the great composers alive today. And, people say, well, there's no great music being written and what's happening. Of course there is. There's always great music being written in every medium it's possible to write music in. The only question is, how do we find it? How do we dig through the junk that's sitting under the cream and give it a push towards cream level? That's the only issue. So Harmonielehre is absolutely fantastic. Then there's Schnittke's Cello Concerto No. 1 from 1986, which I talked about rather recently. A harrowing, brilliant, spooky, emotionally relentless, at times transfiguring, exalted, unbelievable piece of music. My goodness, it is so expressionistically, on point. It just goes for your jugular, and the moods it expresses, many of them are dark and really sort of horripilating, really scary. It'll make your hair stand on edge if you have any. But and a lot of it is just witty and funny, and some of it is hauntingly lyrical and beautiful. It's an extraordinary piece of music, and it's been also recorded quite a few times. Cellists are in are in a rush to take it up, as well they should be, because it's wonderful. I think it might be difficult to program because it's a full half of a concert work all by itself, and it really needs to be treated as a solo all by itself kind of work, and it ends, of course, quietly. It doesn't exactly get you out of your seat in that way, but boy, is it a wonderful work. So that's another masterpiece that has enjoyed several recordings and may fall into the cream category. Then Steve Reich, Different Trains from 1988. This is for quartet and taped voices. It's one of the most marvelous uses of that sort of electronics and acoustic instruments that you'll ever hear in your life. It's a deeply moving work. It's, as the title suggests, it contains the voices of trains going in different places, and you have everybody from an African-American train porter, with his all aboard stuff and whatnot, to trains going to the concentration camps during World War II. And it's a mixture of all these different elements. So it has a deeply moving quasi-political message, but one that's delivered in the way political messages in music should be delivered. That is, purely in terms of the expressive meaning of the music. You don't have to subscribe to the politics. You don't have to care about the politics. You just have to feel the emotion, which you do. Now, Reich is our exemplar of the minimalist movement, and he's, of course, one of the greatest exemplars of the minimalist movement and another absolutely great American composer. One of the things about contemporary music and dealing with what is the cream level is that there are movements in contemporary music, whereas there weren't so much before. There was, the academic serialists, for example, or the Second Viennese School. It was a movement. And neoclassicism, it was a movement. It was an aesthetic movement, but it occurred within the wider expanse of musical performance with standard forces and like quasi-normal people. Minimalism and other isms and other avant-garde isms are operating on a different level. They have their own followings. They have their own sect, if you want to call it that, their own cult, if it gets to ridiculous extremes, but their own audience, and their own audience with their own ensembles and their own performing forces. That militates against the kind of wider popularity that you might find. You don't see a lot of string quartets and electronics running around. And also, because these recordings are supervised by the composer under ideal circumstances, it's not likely that you're going to find many multiple recordings of the same works over and over again. There are some exceptions. But by and large, they are proprietary pieces. And so they're not designed to be part of the classical canon, for example. They don't dwell in that world. And so what's going to happen to these pieces? I don't know. It could be that simply the body of recorded literature of such music is and remains its own thing. And it's a totally separate thing. I don't know. I don't know where it's going. It'll be interesting to see how it's all integrated into the wider discussion of contemporary music and music history 500 years from now. So check in 27, 23, and we'll see where we are with some of these things and how the music of the 20th and 21st centuries is regarded by those later generations. After Reich, let's see, we're up to number 9. Rautavaara, the great Finnish composer, Symphony No. 7, Angel of Light. This was one of his breakthrough pieces because, oh, what a smart title it was. Give something a quasi-religious title and kabanga! You're already there, because a lot of, transcendental and new agey kind of music is all about that stuff. And so there's an audience. Again, there's an audience for it. In this case, it might have been something of a crossover audience. But be that as it may, Rautavaara was a tremendous symphonist and one hell of a nice guy, because I knew him very well. And the Symphony No. 7 created an enormous splash in the tiny microscopic world of classical music when it was released on Ondine, and it has since been re-recorded. I think Naxos has a recording. Bis has a recording of it. It's lovely. It's absolutely lovely and luminous, as the title suggests. And, Rautavaara got to spend a lot of time talking about angels, which he regarded as not just nice, sweet creatures, but also fearsome and terrifying creatures, all of which gave him an excuse to write music that was not soporific or cheap or superficial or, based in a sort of witless religiosity. It was all simply running the gamut of expressive possibilities, but in terms of this vision of angels that he had. And there's a whole series of angel works, some of which are quite easy to listen to, such as this, and some of which are quite gnarly and difficult and scary. So, he actually was very, very smart in the way that he promoted this stuff. And I have no problem with clever promotion. I just hate stupid promotion, and I hate phony promotion, snake oil sales. But this is none of that. This is sincere, beautiful music and expressively true music by a master composer, and it deserves every bit of attention that it's gotten since 1994. And now we passed the year 2000, and here's sort of a questing piece for you to sort of figure out for yourself where it's going. It's George Crumb, who just passed away, within the past year. His American Songbooks. Now, this is a series. I think there are 7 of them at this point, however many he wrote, of works based on American folk and popular music, but arranged, chromatized for voice, whether it's a male voice or female voice, and piano, amplified piano, and just boatloads of percussion. And they are fabulous, fabulous song settings, strange, exotic, eerie settings that distort the melodies in wonderful ways. And they're usually long interludes, separating the two halves of each cycle. So you get some Crumb orchestral stuff or instrumental stuff, as well. And these were composed between 2003 and 2010. And they are masterworks. They are absolutely works of transcendent genius in terms of Crumb's own style, his feeling for timbre, his handling of instruments, his ability to manipulate familiar material. It's just wonderful. Wonderful, wonderful stuff. They've all been recorded by Bridge Records, as part of their complete Crumb edition. And, one of the things that makes this interesting is that there are no other recordings at this point. These are the only ones. And again, whether they'll be taken up by other singers or other artists is an open question. We don't know. It's hard to tell because they require, again, amplified piano, crap loads of percussion. It's not your normal recital setup. And much of what Crumb wrote was not. It required very special performing forces. And so that limits the possibility of the music having a normal life in the concert hall. Whether it has one on disc and it just spreads through the digisphere is something we'll have to decide. So there are 10 works written since 1960. I know you're going to have like millions of them, and there are. There's so much great music written by wonderful composers. I haven't touched on Lutoslawski and Penderecki, the Polish guys. There's no end to it. I haven't spoken about Leo Brouwer, the greatest guitar composer that ever lived, probably. He's alive, hopefully. I think he's still alive. He's in Cuba. He's doing splendidly, as far as I know. I could just think of one after another. A boatload of American composers. Jennifer Higdon, who's getting a lot of attention now. There's tons of it. There's just tons of it. And it's all a question of how do we sort through it? How do we pay attention to it? And what matters to us? And I'm trying to help us do that as best I can, given the discography and the limitations of time and everything else. But there you go. So that's my list of 10 masterworks since 1960 that I think could have been in a Building a Record Library book, such as Howard Taubman's. It is now in my Building a Library channel. And there they are. And I'm so happy to be able to talk about them and share them with you. So keep on listening, friends. Take care.